With the summer around the corner, Mark decided it was time to finally start his DIY project in the garden. But as he and one of his buddies started to stake out their project, Mark felt a hard object touching the end of his shovel. He started digging more and unearthed a giant object, but at first, he was unsure what it was. Mark decided to sleep on it overnight, but in the middle of the night, Mark woke up with a start and suddenly realized what it really was, and he called the police immediately to explain that he needed their help ASAP. However, the moment the officer laid eyes on it, Mark knew he had been correct. The police told Mark he shouldn't have seen this, and he couldn't agree more. Within minutes, there were at least 20 other officers on the scene taking care of the matter. Mark was quickly transported to the police station. He was going to have a lot of explaining to do. But what did Mark find on his property? Why did the police get involved, and why was Mark not supposed to see this thing? Before we start, smash the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. Mark's wife, Patricia, had been on his ass about finally getting a pool in the garden for nearly 5 years by now. It was a promise that he had made when they bought the house, but one that he had not yet delivered. They were not going on vacation this summer, and thus he had a lot of free time this year. He figured that it was a case of now or never. He hoped he would be able to finish it in about 3 weeks, but Mark would quickly run into some unexpected problems that he could not solve himself. The first step in making the pool was to dig out the hole in the garden. Because he did not want to spend too much money on the project, Mark decided to take this upon himself with the help of his 2 sons, Toby and Brian. On the second day of digging, Mark had almost gotten the hole to the depth he intended. However, he feared the worst when his shovel suddenly hit something and sounded different than wood. Mark and his sons spent the rest of the day trying to unearth their find as much as possible. But the more they got to see the metal object, the less they understood what they were dealing with. The only way that Mark could describe it was that it looked like a giant rusted metal bullet. He considered telling somebody about his find, somebody who might know more about it, but he also knew this could come with some unwanted consequences. The object would probably have to be studied and removed very carefully, and then his whole garden might get torn apart to see if other finds could be made. He decided that the best course of action was to keep the find secret. But even with his decision made, the metal object did not leave Mark's mind that evening. He tried just to fall asleep that night, but he quickly realized that his mind was still too busy thinking about the metal object. He decided to do some research on it. He had already looked online for what it could be without any success, but had also thought of another way to investigate. He started going through the old documentation of the house to see where it was that they bought it from 5 years ago. Maybe he could contact that man and ask him if he knew more about it. He could not find much useful information about the man, but he managed to find an email address he could use. And so, with nothing to lose, he sent the man a quick message about his find. Only 2 minutes later, Mark got a message back in his inbox. He was very surprised to get such a quick response, but even more surprised by the contents of the email. When reading it, he even felt a shiver go over his spine. He had not expected to hear this tonight. The email did not explain exactly what Mark was dealing with, but it did contain a very stern warning about the object. The man begged Mark to leave the object and bury it again. Mark was stunned by the response and immediately sent an email back to ask for clarification, but realized the email address had blocked him. This meant he could no longer communicate with the man, but instead of listening to the warning of the previous owner, the interaction only made Mark more curious as wondered, what the hell am I dealing with? The very next morning, Mark decided to call the police and share his find with them. Their first reaction was one of disbelief. Mark's story, which was incredibly strange, sounded made up. Eventually, Mark did manage to convince the officers to send somebody out to his house to come and check out his find. But soon after the police officer arrived at the house, Mark knew he would not get off easy here. While the officer was fairly clueless at first when he was led into the garden, it did not take long for him to realize what was actually going on here. and it worried him greatly. The police officers were wary of Mark, suspecting that he was feigning ignorance about the mysterious object in his backyard. They doubted if he had actually had a conversation with the previous owner, as the email address had gone out of service. This proved not to be good for Mark. Thinking that Mark was simply trying to put the blame on someone else, the police officers cuffed him. Mark was taken aback by this, as he found himself unexpectedly being the one apprehended. He tried to call for Patricia, his wife or 2 sons, but was swiftly taken away. After Mark was taken to the station, he found himself stuck in an interrogation room where across from him a detective sat. Mark tried to tell him about the past owner, but the detective quickly dismissed that. Mark felt hopeless. Mark made the decision to halt his own defense and would not utter another word until he had a lawyer present to guide him through this legal minefield. Mark and Patricia's house, once orderly, was now the center stage of an investigation of their own. A whirlwind of documents had scattered along the living room floor. However, they seemed to have hit the jackpot when they came across files that were around 11 years old. Hidden amongst those pages, the family found mention of a permit issued to the previous owner. The documentation indicated that the area of repair coincided with the exact spot where their family had decided to place their new pool and coincidentally found the large metallic object. Luckily, one of Mark's sons, Toby, was a private investigator. He found, after a lot of digging, information about the former homeowner. Unfortunately, there was a catch, as he hadn't simply moved across town or to a nearby suburb. No, his new home was on the opposite side of the state. Patricia decided to stay home to support her husband, but their 2 sons, Toby and Brian, had taken it upon themselves to take the 6-hour drive. When Mark's lawyer arrived, he gave Mark a much-needed sense of reassurance. The lawyer knew that Patricia and Mark had lived in the house for about 10 years, and he was unsure of the age of the mysterious object. If the investigators could prove that the strange metal object had been underground for a similar duration, Mark would prove to be in big trouble. When Toby and Brian finally arrived at the old owner's house, they found it empty as no one seemed to be home. He started to look around the property to hopefully stumble upon one of the owners. This gave them new hope, but they did not want to sit by waiting for them to return to their home. What if this yard was another hiding place for objects such as the ones they had found? They told themselves that it was for the betterment of their father. At first, looking at the yard seemed futile, but then Toby stumbled upon the shed, and when he opened it, it truly blew his mind. He immediately took out his phone and snapped some pictures of what he had found. He was sure that whatever was in this shed would help prove his father's innocence. He quickly called Brian to come over. When Brian arrived at the shed, his eyes widened at the sight. He was in immediate agreement with his brother. This could be the breakthrough they needed. Though the shed was nearly filled to the brim with strange objects, the first things they could identify were all different types of metal detectors. However, that wasn't all the boys saw. It appeared that their house's previous owner was a committed collector. The shed was filled with what Toby and Brian could only call old equipment, and some that were even true collectibles. Some of them even had some resemblance to the thing they had found in the yard. The boys noted that an assortment of antique firearms were hanging off the wall. As they looked through the shelves, they could also identify shrapnel used by artillery machines. They knew that they had to inform the police, but a sudden voice stopped them. "What are you doing on my property? What are you doing on my property?" A female voice said behind the 2 brothers. Toby and Brian quickly turned around, their hearts pounding in surprise. Toby quickly gathered his courage. He took a step forward, deciding to take the lead as he started to answer the woman's question. Toby introduced himself. "Forgive the intrusion, ma'am," Toby began, trying to sound as professional as possible. "I'm Mr. Wilson, a private investigator, and I fear that your husband is involved with a police investigation." The brothers saw her elderly face pale. The lights inside the house were now lit up, and the sky started to darken. Stepping over the threshold of the home, Toby and Brian were greeted by the sight of an elderly man in an armchair. The man, presumably John, looked up from his newspaper, his eyebrows knitting in confusion at the sight of the unexpected visitors. Toby approached the elderly man. Extending his hand, he introduced himself as private investigator Tobias Wilson, to which John gave his own. Toby asked if he could record the conversation, to which John agreed. However, Toby and his brother had not imagined where this conversation would eventually lead. Toby decided to kick off the conversation as he was the one with the questions. He was hoping that he would ask the right ones. It could hopefully prove his father's innocence. John, the new owner of your previous home has found an object in his backyard, and though it looks to be very old, a permit points to you digging it up or burying it. John exhaled deeply, releasing the weight of years of unspoken secrets. I had always hoped that the shadows of my past would remain hidden. I had even asked Mark to keep it a secret, but it appears that they have now finally come to the light. He gave Toby a look as he said, "I know you were in my shed, which means you both now know that I have a fondness for collecting old weaponry. This is something I've been doing for decades, often to Dolores' annoyance." He gives a small laugh. "But there was something I had collected to which even she has no knowledge. About 12 years ago, I came across a tip. There was a deserted area being used for military exercises, not all too far from my former residence. However," John said, "as the entire perimeter was secured and clearly off limits to civilians, I wouldn't let that stop this. So the next thing I did was illegal," he continued. "My greed overwhelmed my better judgment. I simply couldn't resist, and I found my way in. Initially, I was just looking for bits and pieces to add to my collection, but then I stumbled upon it, that large metallic beast. When I saw it, I couldn't bear to leave it behind. Authorities looking for it." His voice grew softer. "I used to store it in the shed of my old home, but then whispers grew into news headlines, claiming a dangerous piece of military equipment that had gone missing. Panic set in when authorities began door-to-door searches." He paused. "They claimed the risk of public safety. I knew I had to do something," deciding to bury it. "My garden was still a mess due to redoing the plumbing and as they were closing up the hole. In my desperation, I saw it as an opportunity to bury it for good, as it seemed like the perfect hiding spot." He swallowed hard before the next part, unsure of how to word what he had found. "I understand the gravity of my actions, trespassing, theft from a military site. However, my intentions were never malicious. I was just afraid of the consequences, particularly as I was just beginning to enjoy being a grandfather. I thought burying my mistakes would allow me to go on with my life." Toby, who was still trying to piece the puzzle together, questioned, "If you didn't want this secret to get out, then why did you choose to move?" To which John answered, "Most of our relatives, Dolores and mine, reside on this side of the state." However, that wasn't all John said, as the next part raised the hairs on Toby's neck. What if the newspapers were right? John continued, "Being close to family was a draw, but there was also that ever-gnawing of unease. Every night, I felt the weight of what lay beneath our garden. In the morning, I would read the newspaper, fearing that the news would confirm what I had always suspected about the object. Our lives meant too much to risk over such a thing." Toby started to lean in, his recording device in hand, as he asked the most burning question in his mind. "All these years, all this secrecy, what exactly do you believe you unearthed, John?" After Toby's question, the room went silent. "I am convinced it was a bomb, and not just any bomb, a massively destructive one. The relentless search, the urgency from the military, they wouldn't have been so desperate if it was anything less significant." Toby and Brian looked at each other and thanked the man. They hoped this would prove their father's innocence. With John's confession recorded, Toby and Brian thanked the elderly couple for their time and made their way back to their hometown. They were anxious on the ride back, Would the evidence, nay, testimony of John, be enough? Luckily, they would find out sooner rather than later. When they arrived at the police station the next morning, they played the recording for the officers in charge of their father's case. The room was thick with anticipation as John's words settled in. They had to discuss this new evidence and make sure that the bomb was safely extracted, as even if it was a dud, it could still pose a danger. Mark was released and hugged his wife and sons. Upon their return, the police, along with military personnel, had already safely extracted the bomb from their yard. The yard, aside from it being unearthed, seemed peaceful again. However, they had no idea that this commotion would once again return in the following months. Months later, the backyard was once again full of activity, but this time it was filled with the sounds of laughter and splashing. Patricia's dream of having a pool seemed to finally come true. Together, they celebrated that their journey had come to an end.